On your knees, he said. That's your rank now. The badge hit the marble floor, before she even blinked. Nobody in that room knew her name. Nobody knew she'd already spent 13 minutes watching every single one of them decide quietly who deserved respect and who didn't. He grabbed a champagne glass, shoved it into her hand. Smile and serve. That's all women like you are good for. The room laughed. She set the glass down. Slow. Deliberate. Opened a worn leather notebook. And wrote something down. He started counting. 10. 9. 8. A countdown, like she was a stray dog being chased off someone else's property. 3. 2. 1. The double doors flew open. 4 generals walked in. Stopped in front of her. Saluted. General Winters. The command is ready for your inspection, ma'am. His champagne glass slipped from his fingers. Because the woman he told to crawl outranked every single person in that room. And she had just written down every word.
The champagne glass hit her palm before she even saw it coming. Cold, slick, deliberate. Charlotte Winters did not flinch. She had trained her whole life not to flinch. Boot camp taught her that. Ranger school taught her that. 12 years of rising through ranks that were never built for a woman like her taught her that, lesson after lesson, room after room, until stillness became armor, until stillness became the only weapon she needed. Your new rank, sweetheart, the young lieutenant said, loud enough for the room to hear. Waitress, smile and serve. Someone laughed, then another, then the whole hall, a wave of sound rolling toward her like something alive. Charlotte set the glass down, slowly, precisely, the way a surgeon sets down an instrument after making the incision. She looked at him, not with fear, not with fury, with something far more dangerous, recognition, because in 11 minutes this man's entire world was going to collapse, and he had no idea. Rewind 48 hours. Camp Ashcombe, Virginia, sat under a September sky the color of gunmetal. 40 acres of runway and razor wire. 2 hangars big enough to swallow commercial jets. A special operations training compound where men like Bradley Sinclair walked like they owned the ground beneath them. Because he did. In every way that mattered here. The base had a rhythm to it. Trucks rolling before dawn. Boots on pavement in perfect, unthinking cadence. Flags snapping in a wind that never quite stopped blowing off the tidal flats to the east. To an outsider, it might have looked like order. Discipline. The kind of place where everything ran the way the manual said it should. Except manuals don't account for what happens in the spaces between the lines, and Camp Ashcombe had learned, over years, exactly how to live in those spaces. Colonel Gerald Preston stood in his office at 6 in the morning, staring at a stack of manila folders like they might bite him. They might as well have. Complaint files, 18 months of them. Buried, most of them. Stamped, filed, forgotten. Except now someone wanted to see them. Someone with 3 stars and a title that made grown men's hands shake when they said it out loud. Inspector General's Office. Command Climate Review. 6 words, that was all the memo said. 6 words, and Preston hadn't slept in 2 nights. He opened the top folder. Read the first line. Closed it again. Because some things, once you read them, you cannot unread. He thought about calling his wife, decided against it. What would he even say? That 26 years of careful, quiet management were about to be picked apart by someone he'd never met, someone whose name he didn't even know yet, someone reduced in the memo to a title with no face attached. He picked up the phone instead, called his executive officer. Move everything, he said. The complaint logs, the incident reports, all of it. Locked cabinet, my office today. A pause on the other end. Sir, if the review team asks. They won't ask what they don't know exists, Preston said. Smile. Answer briefly. Volunteer nothing. He hung up before the XO could argue. Outside his window, the base was already stirring. Trucks rolling across the tarmac. Boots on pavement. And somewhere in Barracks Row, a 24-year-old petty officer named Meredith Callahan was ironing her whites for the 3rd time that morning, because the first 2 times her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not from fear exactly, from something closer to dread. the kind that lives in your stomach for months and never quite leaves. Meredith had been at Ashcombe 2 years. 2 years of trays and silver service, and being looked through like glass. 2 years of learning the unwritten rule that ran through every hallway on this base like a current under still water. If you were junior, if you were a woman, if you didn't have the right last name attached to the right admiral, you kept your head down. She'd broken that rule 3 times, filed 3 complaints, watched all 3 disappear into Preston's office, like stones dropped into a well, no splash, no echo, nothing coming back up. The first one still made her chest go tight if she let herself think about it too long. A senior chief, twice her age, standing close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, telling her, loud enough for half the mess hall to hear, that she'd taken a spot from someone who earned it. Quota higher. That was the phrase. She hadn't even understood, in the moment, that it was meant as an insult, because it took her a second to realize he wasn't joking. She'd filed the complaint that same afternoon. 11 days later, 4 words came back. Matter reviewed. No action required. No explanation. No follow-up. No one had even asked her what happened. The second complaint still sat somewhere deep in her. A splinter she'd never managed to work free. Someone had left a mop outside her barracks door. A note taped to the handle, your real assignment. She never found out who wrote it, never found out who thought it was funny enough to leave there for the whole hallway to see before she got back from her shift. She'd reported it, logged into the system, marked received, and then nothing. Not even a denial. Just silence, stretching out for months. The kind of silence that eventually starts to feel less like even over it and more like a decision. The last one still burned worst of all, 8 months old now. A remark from Bradley Sinclair, tossed off so casually he probably didn't remember saying it, delivered in a hallway with the same ease another man might use to comment on the weather. They keep lowering the bar. She remembered every word. Remembered the way he hadn't even bothered to lower his voice. Hadn't bothered to check who else might be standing close enough to hear. She remembered filing the complaint that same afternoon. Her hands steadier than they'd been for the first 2, because by then she'd already learned what to expect. Insufficient evidence of hostile intent. Case closed. 3 days. That was how long it took them to bury it. 3 days, when her first 2 complaints had taken weeks to receive even that much of a response. Which told her something, which told her exactly how fast the machine moved when it wanted to protect someone, and exactly how slow it moved when it didn't. She smoothed the front of her uniform, checked her reflection in the barracks mirror. Told herself the same thing she told herself every morning, the same small ritual that had somehow kept her upright for 2 years running. Get through today, just today. She didn't know yet that today was the day everything at Camp Ashcombe would come apart at the seams. Bradley Sinclair woke up feeling like a king, because that was how he woke up most days. 29 years old, 2 deployments, a Silver Star nomination sitting on some desk in the Pentagon, waiting for a signature that everyone assured him was a formality. His father had called it a formality too. Retired Navy Captain Howard Sinclair, a man whose voice still carried the weight of 30 years of command even now, sitting in a house in Annapolis with nothing to command but a golf cart and a standing Sunday dinner reservation. The day you stop being the loudest voice in the room, his father used to say, is the day you lose. Bradley had built his entire life around never losing. He looked good in his dress whites. He knew he looked good. He'd known it since basic, since the instructors singled him out for the recruiting posters, since the officers' wives started finding reasons to introduce their daughters at command socials. Golden boy. That was the word people used. Nobody used it to his face. Exactly. But he heard it in the hallways. He liked it. He'd built a career in some ways on making sure he kept hearing it, which was, if he'd ever stopped to think about it, a strange thing to build a career on. Except he never stopped to think about it. Thinking too hard about things like that felt dangerously close to doubt, and doubt was for other people. Doubt was for the ones who flinched. Today there was an inspection. Some inspector general nonsense, some review nobody could name. Didn't matter. Reviews came. Reviews went. Ashcombe always came out clean. Because Ashcombe always knew how to look clean. He straightened his collar in the mirror, practiced the smile he used for cameras. Tilted his chin, the way the recruiting photographer had once told him made his jaw look sharper. Because somewhere, deep down, in a place he never examined too closely, Bradley Sinclair believed the world had already decided he was untouchable. He was about to find out how wrong a man could be. The sedan came through the main gate at 4:47 that afternoon. No flags, no escort vehicles, just a plain government car with government plates, moving at a pace that drew no attention at all, which was exactly the point. Inside, Major Renee Dawson gripped the wheel with both hands and glanced sideways at the woman beside her. "Ma'am," Dawson said, "they're not going to know who you are." "I know," Charlotte said. "Protocol requires." "I know what protocol requires, Major." Charlotte's voice was calm, even. The voice of someone who had made this decision a long time ago and had never once regretted it. "I want to see what they do when they think no one important is watching." Dawson didn't argue further. She'd learned, in the 8 months she'd served as Charlotte's aide, that arguing rarely changed anything. Charlotte Winters made decisions the way other people breathed, quietly, constantly, without asking permission. Still. Dawson glanced at her one more time. "Whatever happens in there," Dawson said, "I've got the second car staged a half-mile out. One call." "I know," Charlotte said again, softer this time, because that was the thing about Dawson she trusted most. Not her efficiency, though that mattered. Her instinct for exactly when silence needed to end and reassurance needed to begin. The car stopped at the gate. Charlotte stepped out. Gray suit, no ribbons, no insignia, a worn leather notebook tucked under her left arm, its cover soft from years of handling. The corners rounded from 100 briefcases and 1,000 hours of travel. She could have been anyone, a contractor, a spouse who'd taken a wrong turn looking for the commissary, a civilian employee running late for an appointment nobody would remember scheduling. That was the design. The gate guard glanced at her standard DOD identification, glanced at her face, waved her through without a second look. Because he saw a woman in a cheap gray suit, and cheap gray suits didn't get second looks at Camp Ashcombe. Charlotte walked through the gate alone, the notebook pressed against her ribs like something she was protecting. In a way, she was. Because inside that notebook, alongside blank pages waiting to be filled, was a photograph she carried everywhere and showed no one. A man in a Navy uniform, younger than she was now, smiling like the world hadn't yet decided to break him. Her father. She didn't think about him often, couldn't afford to. Grief was a luxury, like anger, and Charlotte Winters had learned long ago that inspectors couldn't afford luxuries. But sometimes, walking into a place like this, she felt him beside her, which was foolish, which was sentimental, which was exactly the kind of thing she never let show on her face. So she didn't let it show now. She walked past the flagpole, past a row of parked vehicles gleaming under the September sun, past a group of junior enlisted moving crates from one hangar to another, none of them sparing her more than half a glance. Good, she thought. That's exactly right. Keep moving. Don't look twice. Because the moment this base starts looking twice at strangers is the moment it stops being honest with itself. She walked into the reception hall at 4:58 and found a spot near the back wall, between a folded American flag in a glass case and a portrait of some long-retired admiral whose name she didn't bother to read. And she watched. The room was already full, white tablecloths. Champagne flutes lined up in silver rows, catching the overhead light and throwing tiny fractured rainbows across the marble. Officers clustered by rank the way oil clusters on water, refusing to mix. Junior enlisted moved between them carrying trays, invisible in the particular way. Only service staff, at events like this, ever become invisible. She watched Preston check his watch every 2 minutes. His smile stretched thin across his face like a rubber band about to snap. She watched a lieutenant commander take a glass off a passing tray without looking at the young woman carrying it. Watched him turn to his colleague and say, "Loud enough to carry. They'll let anyone serve at these things now." She watched the young woman's jaw tighten, watched her keep walking, watched no one else in the room notice at all. Charlotte opened her notebook, wrote 3 words, closed it again. That was Meredith Callahan's first appearance in Lieutenant General Charlotte Winter's report, though neither of them knew it yet. Then she heard the laughter start across the room, and she understood, before she even saw him, exactly what kind of night this was going to be, because laughter like that had a shape to it, a particular cruelty. She'd heard it before, in other rooms, on other bases, over the span of a career spent watching men build their confidence on the backs of people too junior to fight back. She turned toward the sound and found Bradley Sinclair looking directly at her. He noticed her, the way a hawk notices movement in tall grass. Not because she mattered, because she was different, because everything about her, the plain suit, the absence of rank, the stillness, snagged against the grain of a room built entirely on hierarchy. He nudged the officer beside him. Who let her in? The officer shrugged. Bradley straightened his dress whites, crossed the room. 4 junior officers fell in behind him, trailing like a small parade nobody had asked to attend. He didn't walk toward her, he advanced, chin up, shoulders rolling, every step announcing the same unspoken sentence. This is my house. He stopped 2 feet away. Excuse me. His voice carried deliberately across the hall. Conversations nearby died out one by one. The way lights go dark in a building at the end of a long day, you look a little lost. This event is for military personnel. Actual military personnel. Charlotte looked at him. Calm, steady. I'm exactly where I need to be. Bradley smiled. Not a kind smile. The kind that precedes something worse. He turned to his audience, already watching, already leaning in. She says she's where she needs to be. A ripple of laughter. He turned back to her. What's your rank, sweetheart? A beat. A pause designed to let the insult land before the punchline. Oh, right. Trash doesn't get a rank. The words hit the room like a slap. Charlotte's expression didn't change, not a flinch, not a blink, which bothered him more than he expected, because people always flinched. Junior enlisted flinched, contractors flinched, even officers 2 ranks below him found some way to shrink when Bradley Sinclair turned his attention on them. This woman stood there like stone, so he pushed harder. He reached for the visitor badge stuck to her lapel, ripped it free, held it up between 2 fingers like something dirty he'd found on the floor. Lauren. He read the false name on the badge aloud, drawing out each syllable with exaggerated disgust, because the badge had been printed for a contractor's visit weeks earlier and reused without correction, and neither of them cared enough right now to note the mistake. No last name, no rank. He let it drop to the marble floor. Just Lauren. You know what that tells me? He looked down at the fallen badge, back up at her. Pick it up, on your knees. That's your rank now. The room did not gasp. That was the worst part. The room adjusted. A few officers looked away, suddenly fascinated by their drinks. Most didn't look away at all. Some lifted their phones, angling for a better shot, because a room that has learned cruelty as entertainment will always find someone eager to record it. Colonel Preston, standing 30 feet away with a champagne flute in his hand, saw the whole thing. He took a sip, turned to greet a passing contractor, because looking away was easier than looking at what his command had become. Charlotte did not pick up the badge, did not look at it. She looked at Bradley. Are you done? 2 words, quiet, not angry, not scared. Just a question hanging there in the space between them like something waiting to be answered. Bradley's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being asked questions. He was used to asking them. Used to watching people scramble for the right response, the response that ended the confrontation, the response that let them escape with whatever dignity he decided to leave them. This woman offered him nothing to work with. No fear to feed on, no anger to redirect, just stillness and a question he didn't know how to answer, so he grabbed a champagne glass off a passing tray instead. Meredith Callahan's tray. She froze for half a second, eyes darting between Bradley's face and the woman standing so calmly in front of him. She recognized that look on his face. She'd seen it aimed at herself 8 months ago, in a hallway that suddenly felt very far away and very close at the same time. Don't get involved, she told herself. Not now. Not like this. Except her feet weren't moving away. They were staying exactly where they were, tray shaking almost imperceptibly in her hands, because some part of her had already decided this was a moment worth watching all the way through. Bradley pushed the glass into Charlotte's hand. Not gently, the crystal pressed hard against her palm. Your new rank, waitress, smile and serve. That's all women like you are good for. Someone behind him laughed, then more laughter, rippling, feeding on itself, growing louder with every second. Nobody stopped it. A lieutenant commander raised his glass in a mock toast. She outranks the dishwasher. The laughter peaked. Charlotte held the glass for exactly 3 seconds. Then she set it down, carefully, precisely, the way someone handles evidence they intend to use later. She opened her notebook, wrote something. Bradley watched her write, and for the first time all evening, something flickered behind his eyes. Not fear, not yet. Confusion. Because who writes things down at a party? Who stands still through humiliation and reaches for a pen instead of the exit? He buried the thought before it could finish forming. You know what your problem is? He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the bourbon on his breath. You think showing up in a cheap suit makes you somebody. It doesn't. You're nobody. You're less than nobody. His voice dropped, low enough that the officers behind him leaned in to catch every word. People like you don't earn ranks. You earn mops. You earn toilet brushes. You earn the privilege of cleaning up after men like me. He spread his arms, gesturing at the room around them. Every person here has bled for this country. And you walked in off the street like a stray dog looking for scraps. Charlotte closed the notebook. Only the ones who don't belong. And who decides who belongs? Bradley spread his arms wider. I do, look around. You see anyone here who looks like you? The question hung in the air. Because he wasn't entirely wrong. The room was full of pressed uniforms and polished shoes, and people who all seemed to belong to the same unspoken club. And Charlotte, in her plain gray suit, looked like she'd wandered in from a different world, entirely. Meredith stood 6 feet away, frozen, still holding her tray, white-knuckled. She had heard every word. She had lived every word. Different day, different man. Same script. Bradley wasn't finished. He was never finished until someone left the room in tears or in silence, and Charlotte was offering him neither. I'm going to give you 10 seconds to walk out that door, he said. And if you don't, I'll have security escort you out. And trust me, sweetheart, they won't be gentle about it. He held up one hand, started counting down on his fingers. 10, 9, 8. Charlotte didn't move. 7, 6, 5. The officers behind him joined in, a chorus now, like a countdown at a football game. Like this was entertainment instead of cruelty. 4, 3, 2. Charlotte looked past Bradley, past the laughing officers, past Preston, still pretending not to see. She looked at Meredith. Their eyes met for one full second. Meredith saw something in the woman's face she couldn't name. Not anger, not humiliation. Something deeper, something that looked, impossibly, like a promise. Hold on, that look said, though no words passed between them at all. Just hold on a little longer. 1, Bradley said. He dropped his hand. Time's up. Get out. Charlotte did not get out. She reached down, picked up her fallen visitor badge from the marble floor, placed it inside her notebook, closed the notebook, tucked it under her arm, stood exactly where she was. The room went quiet. The countdown energy evaporated. All at once, like air rushing out of a room through a door, someone forgot to close. Something had shifted. Bradley could feel it, even if he couldn't name it. The woman wasn't leaving, crying, wasn't calling for help. She was waiting, and that, more than anything he'd said or done, unsettled him. Fine. His voice had lost half its volume. Your funeral. He turned his back on her, walked toward the bar. His entourage followed, slower now, a few of them glancing back over their shoulders. One young ensign looked like he wanted to say something. He didn't. Because saying something meant standing out. And standing out at Camp Ashcombe had never once ended well for anyone junior enough to still be learning the rules. Preston checked his watch. 4:58. The delegation was due at 5. His phone buzzed. A text from the gate guard. Delegation vehicles approaching. 4 stars confirmed. ETA 2 minutes. Preston straightened his tie, took a breath, put on his best commanding officer face. He had no idea the delegation's lead inspector was already inside the building, had been for the last 13 minutes, and had just filled 3 pages of her notebook with everything she needed. Because that was the thing about Charlotte Winters that no one at Camp Ashcombe understood yet. She didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. She didn't need rank on display to hold power in a room. She only needed to watch and write and wait. At exactly 5 o'clock, the double doors at the far end of the reception hall swung open. The sound hit first, boot heels on marble, synchronized, sharp. The kind of sound that makes every spine in a room straighten on instinct, whether the owner of that spine wants it to or not. A young protocol officer appeared in the doorway. Nervous. His voice cracked on the first word. Attention on deck. The room snapped to stillness. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses froze halfway to open mouths. Every head turned toward the door. 4 generals entered. Major General Ellen Carter, Major General Daniel Foster, Brigadier General Thomas Reed, Brigadier General Howard Wilson, each one in full dress uniform, each one carrying enough stars and ribbons across their chests to catch the light and throw it back across the room in small, sharp flashes. They walked in a line, not fast, not slow, the pace of people who don't need to hurry, because the world has already learned to wait for them. Preston stepped forward, hand extended, his smile snapping back into place like a mask he'd rehearsed 1,000 times. Generals, welcome to Camp Ashcombe. We've prepared. Carter walked past him, Foster walked past him, Reed walked past him, Wilson walked past him. Preston's hand hung in the air like a question nobody planned to answer. His mouth stayed open. No sound came out, because in 26 years of service, Gerald Preston had never once been ignored like that. Not by a junior officer. Not by an enlisted soldier. Certainly not by 4 generals walking through his own reception hall like he was furniture. What is happening? That was the only thought his mind could produce, over and over, looping without resolution. What is happening? What is happening? Why won't anyone look at me? The 4 generals crossed the room in silence. Every eye followed them. Bradley stood near the bar, champagne glass in hand, watching with mild curiosity. This was the inspection team. Fine. He'd seen generals before. They came, they toured, they left. Nothing ever changed at Ashcombe. Nothing ever had to. Then they stopped. They stopped in front of the woman in the gray suit. Major General Ellen Carter, 31 years of service, a reputation for breaking careers, the way other people broke bread, squared her shoulders, locked her eyes forward, saluted. General Winters. The command is ready for your inspection, ma'am. Foster saluted, Reed saluted, Wilson saluted, 4 generals, 4 salutes, aimed at the woman Bradley Sinclair had told 30 seconds earlier to get on her knees. The silence that followed wasn't the polite kind. It was the kind that comes right before a building collapses, the kind where everyone in the room realizes, all at once, that the ground beneath their feet has been hollow the entire time. Bradley's champagne glass tilted in his hand. Liquid ran over his fingers. He didn't notice. His brain was doing math it couldn't solve. The woman, the gray suit, no ribbons, no insignia, General Winters. No, that's not possible. That name only belonged to one person in the entire United States Army, and Bradley had heard it exactly once before, whispered in a briefing he'd half paid attention to, a name attached to a title that made even colonels lower their voices. Lieutenant General Charlotte Winters. Inspector General of the United States Army. The woman he had called trash, the woman he had told to get on her knees, the woman he had counted down like a stray dog being chased out of a yard. She outranked every single person in that room. She outranked him by a distance so vast it didn't have a name. Say something. Fix this. There has to be something you can say. Except there wasn't, and some primal part of him already knew it. The part that had gone cold and still the second Carter's hand snapped up in salute. Charlotte returned the salutes. One crisp motion, economical, practiced through years of exactly this kind of moment, though never quite like this one. Then she opened her notebook, the same notebook she'd been writing in for the last 13 minutes, and turned to Preston. Colonel Preston, I'll need your conference room. Your complaint files from the past 24 months, and every incident report filed under your command. A pause, all of them, not the ones you selected. Preston's face lost its color in stages. First his cheeks, then his forehead, then his lips, going the pale gray of old paper. He looked like a man watching his career walk out of his own body. Ma'am, we weren't informed you would be arriving before that. That's correct. Charlotte closed the notebook. You weren't informed. That was the point. She turned to Major Dawson, who had entered behind the generals carrying a leather briefcase. Major, set up in the conference room. Pull personnel files for all senior staff. Start with the commanding officer and work down. Yes, ma'am. Charlotte looked at the room one more time. Her gaze swept across the officers. The enlisted staff still frozen at the edges of the hall. The phones that had been recording, now lowering slowly, guiltily, into pockets. The champagne glasses. The silver trays. She looked at Bradley. He couldn't meet her eyes. She looked at Meredith. Meredith was shaking, not from fear, from something else entirely. Something that felt, for the first time in 2 years, dangerously close to hope. This is not a courtesy visit, Charlotte said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. This is a formal command inspection under the authority of the Inspector General. Every person in this room is subject to interview. Cooperation is expected. Candor is required. She paused. Let the words settle over the room, like something heavy and inevitable. I've been here for 13 minutes. A breath. I've seen enough to know this inspection will not be brief. She walked toward the hallway. The 4 generals followed. Major Dawson followed. The protocol officer scrambled to catch up, his boot heels no longer synchronized with anyone. The reception hall stood frozen in her wake. Bradley set his glass down on the nearest table. His hand was wet. His fingers were trembling, and he hated that they were trembling. Hated it the way he'd hated nothing else in his life, because trembling was for other people. Trembling was for the ones who flinched. Except he was flinching now. Except there was no one left to blame for it but himself, the lieutenant commander who had toasted. She outranks the dishwasher, was staring at the marble floor like it might open beneath him and swallow him whole. Preston pulled out his phone. His hands shook so badly. It took 3 attempts to unlock it. He needed to call the Judge Advocate General's office. He needed to call his own commanding officer. He needed to call someone. Anyone. But somewhere underneath the panic, in a part of himself he rarely let surface, Gerald Preston already knew the truth. No phone call was going to fix this, because the woman in the gray suit had already seen everything. She had watched him watch Bradley Sinclair tear a stranger apart with words. She had watched him take a sip of champagne and turn away. And she had written it all down. Word travels fast on a military base. It travels faster when the word is catastrophic. By 14 minutes after 4 generals saluted a woman in a plain gray suit, every building on Camp Ashcombe knew. The story moved through hallways and barracks and break rooms like an electrical current, gaining voltage with every retelling. He told her to get on her knees. He called her trash. She's a 3-star Inspector General. He's done. He's absolutely done. In the senior enlisted lounge, a master sergeant set down his coffee mug and said 3 words to no one in particular. God help us. He wasn't talking about Bradley Sinclair specifically. He was talking about all of them, because command climate inspections don't target one man. They target the system that built him. Every ignored policy, every buried complaint, every leader who saw something wrong and decided quietly that it wasn't their problem to fix. Bradley was a symptom. Ashcombe was the disease, and Charlotte Winters had come to cut it open. On the 2nd floor, in a conference room with heavy oak furniture and a view of the flight line, Major Dawson set up a secure laptop on the long table, while 2 officers from the Judge Advocate General's office, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Marsh and Major Owen Reyes, wheeled in boxes of blank interview forms and recording equipment. Charlotte stood alone for a moment at the window, looking out over the runway, the sky beginning its long, slow slide toward evening. She thought about the walk through the gate, the way the guard hadn't looked twice, the way an entire room full of trained officers, men who had sworn oaths, who wore uniforms meant to represent something larger than themselves, had watched a woman be humiliated and decided, one by one, that watching was easier than acting. She thought about her father for exactly 3 seconds, allowed herself exactly 3 seconds, the way she always did, no more, because more than that, and the grief had a way of pulling at threads she needed to keep tightly wound tonight. Then she opened her notebook, turned to a fresh page, wrote a single line at the top, the same line she wrote at the start of every investigation, the line that had become something between a mission statement and a prayer. Someone has to write it down. Behind her, the door opened. Major Dawson stepped back inside. "Ma'am, first witness is ready whenever you are." Charlotte closed the notebook, turned around. "Send them in," she said, because the interviews were about to begin, and somewhere down the hall, in a locker room 3 floors below, a golden boy who had never once considered that the world might not bend around him was about to discover exactly what it felt like to be counted down to 0. And somewhere else on that same base, in a barracks room, with a shoebox under the bed, a young woman named Meredith Callahan was standing very still in front of a closed drawer, trying to decide whether tonight, finally, was the night she stopped being afraid of her own paperwork. The sun had not yet set on Camp Ashcombe, but everything about it had already changed. The first interview began at 5:40 p.m., and it did not stop for 11 hours. Charlotte had set 3 rules before the questioning started. She always set the same 3 rules. On every base, in every command she'd ever walked into with a notebook and a badge that said more than most people ever bothered to read. Rule 1. Every conversation gets recorded with the subject's knowledge, no exceptions. Rule 2. No subject gets interviewed with their commanding officer sitting in the room. Rule 3. Start at the bottom. Work up, because the people with the least rank had the most to say, and the most to lose by saying it. Major Dawson brought the first witness into the conference room at 5:41, a young private, barely out of training, who worked the mailroom, and had clearly never sat across from a 3-star general in his life. He kept adjusting his collar like it had personally offended him. His hands were folded so tight, his knuckles had gone white. "Relax," Charlotte said. "This isn't a court-martial. I just need to understand what daily life looks like on this base." The private swallowed. "It's fine, ma'am. Everything's fine, is it?" Silence. "Let me ask it differently. When was the last time you saw someone treated unfairly, and nobody did anything about it?" The private looked at the recorder, looked at the JAG officer in the corner, looked back at Charlotte. "Today," he said, "in the reception hall. But also, before today, that was the first crack. It would not be the last." Over the next 4 hours, Charlotte and her team interviewed 19 people, junior enlisted, mid-grade petty officers, a handful of junior officers who suddenly discovered they had a great deal to say once nobody in the room outranked them into silence. The pattern emerged the way a photograph develops in a darkroom, slowly at first, then all at once, because the stories were different, but the shape was always the same. A young woman, a petty officer 2nd class, described being told by a senior chief that she'd taken a slot from someone who earned it. She filed a complaint. It got acknowledged. Nothing happened. She'd learned, she said, to keep her eyes on her boots whenever that particular chief walked past. A junior officer described being passed over for a training assignment that went, instead, to someone with fewer qualifications, and a father who golfed with the right people. He asked why. His department head told him to focus on what you can control. He filed a complaint. It got acknowledged. Nothing happened. He'd stopped applying for anything after that, he admitted, staring at the table the whole time he said it. A chief petty officer, gray at the temples, 22 years in, described overhearing a group of officers in the break room, laughing about the ones who only got promoted for optics. He reported it to Preston's executive officer. The XO told him they were just blowing off steam. No complaint was ever filed, because the XO never handed him the form. 22 years, the chief said quietly, near the end of his interview. "I've seen a lot come and go. Never seen anybody actually ask before. Each story, a single thread, together, a rope. and the rope led every single time, straight back to the same door, Colonel Gerald Preston's office. Charlotte kept her face neutral through every interview. She took notes. She asked follow-up questions. She thanked each person for their candor, and meant it every time, in a way that made more than one witness blink hard and look away before they left the room. But inside, something was building. Not anger. Anger was a luxury, and Charlotte had learned a long time ago that inspectors don't get to have luxuries. What she felt instead was colder, sharper. The steady mounting recognition that she was looking at a command that had been rotting from the top for years, and everyone underneath had been breathing that rot for so long they'd started calling it air. Around 8 o'clock, Lieutenant Colonel Marsh stepped out into the hallway to stretch her legs and found Major Dawson leaning against the wall, arms crossed, staring at nothing in particular. "She doing all right in there?" Marsh asked. Dawson considered the question longer than it probably deserved. "She's the same in every room," Dawson said finally. "Doesn't matter how bad it gets. Same voice, same pace. I used to think it was a performance." She shook her head slightly. 8 months working with her, and I still don't know if it's a performance, or if that's just what real steadiness looks like when nobody's ever tested it hard enough to crack it. Marsh looked back through the conference room door, where Charlotte sat listening to a young sailor describe, haltingly, the third time he'd watched someone humiliated in a hallway, and said nothing. "I hope it's the second one," Marsh said. For her sake, at 9:15 Major Dawson knocked on the conference room door. "Ma'am, there's a petty officer 3rd Class Meredith Callahan requesting to speak with the inspection team. She says she has documentation." Charlotte looked up from her notes. She remembered the young woman, the serving tray, the white knuckles, the 1 second of eye contact across a room full of people who had chosen not to see. Send her in. Meredith walked into the conference room, carrying a manila folder against her chest, like a shield. She sat down across from Charlotte, placed the folder on the table, didn't open it. "Take your time," Charlotte said. Meredith took a breath, then another, then she opened the folder. "I've filed 3 formal complaints over the past 18 months. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "I kept copies of all of them, every form, every response, every email." She spread the documents across the table, one at a time, like she was laying out cards in a game only she understood the rules of. The first complaint. A senior chief who'd called her a quota hire in front of 6 other people, filed in March of the previous year. The response, dated 11 days later, 4 words long. "Matter reviewed. No action required. No explanation. No follow-up interview. No contact with the man she'd accused." The second complaint. Someone had left a mop outside her barracks door with a note taped to the handle. "Your real assignment." Filed in July, logged into the system. Marked received. Never updated again. She'd followed up twice by email. Both times nothing came back. The third complaint. Bradley Sinclair. They keep lowering the bar. Filed 8 months ago. This one got a response faster than the other 2. 3 days. Insufficient evidence of hostile intent. Case closed. 3 sentences. No interview with witnesses. No interview with Bradley himself. Case closed. Charlotte read each document slowly, the way someone reads a letter from a world they already suspected existed, but had hoped, somewhere underneath the certainty, they were wrong about. Petty Officer Callahan. Charlotte set the folder down. "When you filed the third complaint, the one about Lieutenant Sinclair, did anyone from the command contact you afterward?" "No, ma'am." "Did anyone interview Lieutenant Sinclair about the incident?" "Not that I know of, ma'am." "Did anyone tell you why the case was closed after 3 days?" "No, ma'am." Meredith's jaw tightened, just slightly. "I just got the email. Case closed." "That was it. Did you ever ask why?" Meredith let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though there was nothing funny in it. "I did, ma'am. I asked the yeoman who processed it. She told me she just types what she's given. Told me not to take it personal." A pause. "It's hard not to take it personal when it's your name on the form." Charlotte placed the documents back inside the folder. She looked at Meredith the way she'd looked at her in the reception hall. Direct, unhurried, completely present. "Did you ever consider not coming here tonight?" Meredith nodded. Yes, ma'am. For about an hour. What changed your mind? A pause. You stood there, Meredith said quietly. He said everything he could think of to make you small, and you just stood there. You didn't yell. You didn't cry. You didn't leave. She looked up. I've been leaving for 2 years. I figured. Maybe it was time to stand. Charlotte held her gaze a long moment, because that sentence landed somewhere deep, somewhere she didn't let show on her face. Not here, not now, but somewhere it would sit for the rest of the night, quietly, waiting. Can I ask you something? Meredith said, before Charlotte could speak again. Ma'am, off the record, if that's allowed. Go ahead. Does it get easier? Standing there, not flinching, or do you just get better at hiding it? Charlotte considered the question with more weight than most people would have given it. Both, she said finally. You get better at hiding it, and eventually, some of the hiding becomes real. Not all of it. But some. Meredith nodded slowly, like she was filing that answer away somewhere important. Charlotte turned to Lieutenant Colonel Marsh. Enter Petty Officer Callahan's complaint records into the investigation file. Flag all 3 for failure to follow equal opportunity processing procedures, and note that Petty Officer Callahan cooperated voluntarily, without any promise of outcome. Yes, ma'am. Charlotte looked at Meredith one more time. Thank you, Petty Officer. What you did tonight took more courage than most people in this building will ever have to find. Meredith stood, nodded, walked out. She made it to the hallway before the tears came. Not sad tears. The kind that come when you've been carrying something so long you forgot how heavy it was until the moment someone finally takes it out of your hands. She stood there a long moment, back against the cool cinder block wall, breathing, letting it happen. Down the hall she could hear Major Dawson calling the next witness. Life going on. The machine still turning. But something in her had shifted, and she suspected it wasn't going to shift back. At 10 p.m. Major Dawson found Charlotte standing alone by the window of an empty office down the hall, phone in hand, the glow of the screen the only light in the room. Dawson started to say something, stopped, backed quietly out the door instead, because some calls aren't meant to be interrupted, and this looked like one of those. The phone rang twice before her mother picked up. Charlotte, her mother's voice, warm and worn soft with age, came through the line like something familiar wrapping around her. It's late there. Everything all right? Long day. Charlotte's voice came out quieter than she intended. Long a night, actually, tell me. And so she did. Not everything. Never everything. But enough. The reception hall. The badge on the marble floor. A young lieutenant counting down from 10 like she was something to be chased off. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Sounds familiar, she finally said. Because it was. Because 31 years ago, a young lieutenant commander named Robert Winters had stood in front of his own commanding officer, with a stack of paperwork in his hands, evidence of contracts awarded to companies that didn't exist, work that was never done, money that disappeared into accounts nobody could trace. He'd done exactly what the regulations told him to do, filed the report, followed the chain of command, trusted the system to do what it claimed it existed to do. The system had other plans. Within 6 months, Robert Winters found himself transferred to a posting nobody wanted, in a town nobody visited, doing work that had nothing to do with the career he'd spent 15 years building. No official punishment, no formal reprimand, just quiet erasure, the kind that doesn't leave fingerprints. He never made captain, never got the command he'd worked his whole life toward, spent his last decade of service watching younger, louder men pass him by, men who had never once had the poor judgment to tell the truth to someone who didn't want to hear it. He died 4 years after retiring. Heart attack, the doctors said. Charlotte had always believed something else got to him first. He used to tell me, her mother said, now, voice steadier than Charlotte expected, that the loudest room isn't always where the truth lives. He said that more than once. I think he needed to believe it, because he never got to see it proven. Charlotte closed her eyes. Because she was standing in a building 300 miles from where her father had once stood, holding evidence of his own, and nobody had saluted him. Nobody had walked in with 4 stars on each shoulder and told him the command was ready for his inspection. He had simply disappeared. Slowly, quietly, the way water disappears from a glass left out too long, until one day you look and it's just gone. I keep thinking about him tonight, Charlotte said. I don't know why. I do, her mother said. A pause. Because you're doing what he never got the chance to finish. Charlotte didn't answer right away. Because there wasn't an answer. Because some truths don't need a response. They just need to be said out loud once, to someone who already understands them. Are you all right? Her mother asked. I will be. That's not the same thing. I know, Charlotte said. It's the best I've got tonight. Her mother laughed softly, the kind of laugh that carries 30 years of worry underneath it, worn smooth by time. He'd be proud of you. You know that. I know. Say it back to me, so I believe you mean it. Charlotte's mouth curved, just slightly, the first real softness that had crossed her face all night. I know, she said again, and this time it landed different. This time it stuck. There's a young woman here, Charlotte said after a moment. Petty officer. 24 years old. She kept every complaint she ever filed in a shoebox under her bed. 18 months of paperwork nobody read. Sounds like someone I raised, her mother said. I'm serious, Mom. So am I. Charlotte let out a breath that was almost a laugh. She asked me if it gets easier, not flinching. What did you tell her? That you get better at hiding it, and some of the hiding becomes real. Her mother was quiet a moment. Is that true? I don't know, Charlotte admitted. I've never actually tested it against a night like this one. Well, her mother's voice softened. Test it, and then call me tomorrow and tell me if it held. They talked another few minutes. Small things, nothing things. The kind of conversation that exists only to keep two people connected across distance a little longer than necessary. Her mother asked about the drive back. Asked if she was eating. Asked, the way she always did, whether Charlotte was sleeping, and accepted the obvious lie without comment. Because some lies are just a way of saying, I love you and please don't worry. Then Charlotte hung up. Stewed alone in the dark office. Notebook still tucked under her arm, the photograph of her father pressed somewhere between its pages like a pressed flower nobody else would ever find. She thought about Meredith Callahan. 24 years old. A shoebox full of complaints nobody read, kept anyway, because some stubborn part of her refused to believe the silence was permanent. Charlotte understood that stubbornness. She'd inherited it, which was, she realized, exactly why she was still standing in this building at 10 o'clock at night instead of somewhere warmer, somewhere easier, because her father hadn't gotten to finish his sentence. So she was going to finish it for him. One command climate review at a time, if that's what it took. She wiped her eyes, straightened her jacket, walked back into the hallway like nothing had happened at all. Because that was the job, and the job wasn't finished. At 10:42, it was Bradley Sinclair's turn. He walked into the conference room in his service uniform now. No dress whites. No entourage trailing behind him like a small parade. Just a man in a chair across a table from the woman he had tried to humiliate 6 hours earlier. Charlotte didn't mention the reception hall directly. She didn't need to. Lieutenant Sinclair. Are you aware of a complaint filed against you by Petty Officer, 3rd Class, Meredith Callahan, approximately 8 months ago? Bradley blinked. Aye, vaguely. It was dismissed, it was closed. Dismissed and closed are different words. Were you ever interviewed about that complaint? No, ma'am. Were you ever informed one had been filed? I heard about it. Through the chain. Charlotte's tone stayed level. Not a formal notification process. Bradley shifted in his seat. I don't recall a formal notification, no. Charlotte made a note. Didn't look up. Let's talk about today in the reception hall. You approached a woman you believed to be a civilian. Can you describe what happened? I asked her if she was in the right place. Is that all you did? Silence. Lieutenant. Charlotte's eyes came up now, steady, unhurried. There are multiple recordings of the interaction on personal devices, currently under review. I would encourage accuracy. Bradley's jaw worked, his eyes dropped to the table. I was out of line. Describe what out of line looked like. Another silence. Longer this time. I made comments about her appearance, her belonging, a breath. I used language that was inappropriate. You called her trash. You told her to get on her knees. You told her that women like her scrub toilets. You initiated a countdown to pressure her into leaving. Charlotte's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Is that accurate? Each sentence landed like a brick stacking on Bradley's chest. Yes, ma'am. And at any point during this, did any officer in the room intervene? No, ma'am. Did Colonel Preston intervene? No, ma'am. Was Colonel Preston present? Bradley hesitated. Something like loyalty and something like survival fought a short, ugly war behind his eyes. Survival won. Yes, ma'am, he was present. Charlotte wrote in her notebook. Didn't look up when she spoke again. Lieutenant, I'm not here to end your career over a single incident. I'm here because a single incident revealed a command climate that allowed it to happen and has been allowing things like it to happen for a long time. She paused. Do you understand the difference? Bradley nodded, slowly. He looked, in that moment, like a man who had just been shown the difference between a crack in a wall and a crack in the foundation underneath it. There's something else, Charlotte said. Something I want you to think about before you answer. Bradley waited. Why did you say those things to me tonight? Not what you said. Why? Where does that come from? Bradley opened his mouth, closed it, because the honest answer had been sitting in him for years, buried under deployments and medals, and a Silver Star nomination he'd been told was already as good as signed, and nobody had ever asked him to dig it up before. My father, he finally said. Charlotte waited. He raised me to believe that being loud was the same as being strong, that if you stopped being the loudest voice in the room, you'd already lost. Bradley's hands, resting on the table, curled slightly. He calls me every week, asks about my file, my evaluations, whether the nomination's moving, and tonight he called before the reception. Told me the inspection team was coming. Told me to make sure nothing came back on the family name. Bradley's voice dropped. He's retired, Navy captain. He still knows people. A breath, he still makes calls. Charlotte's pen stopped moving, because this was the fifth thread pulling loose tonight. The one that led somewhere higher than a reception hall in Virginia, somewhere with a phone line, running all the way back to a house in Annapolis, where a retired officer still believed his name could fix anything his son broke. Has your father contacted anyone connected to this investigation? Bradley's silence answered before his words did. I don't know, ma'am. He might have. He usually does. Usually. Yes, ma'am. Something flickered across Bradley's face. Something that looked almost like exhaustion. It's how it's always worked. Something goes wrong. He makes a call. It stops going wrong. Has that ever bothered you? The question seemed to catch him off guard more than anything else she'd asked all night. I never really let myself think about it, he admitted. It was just how things were. Charlotte closed her notebook. Thank you for your honesty, Lieutenant. That's the first useful thing you've told me all night. Bradley stood, walked toward the door. His hand was on the handle when Charlotte spoke again. Lieutenant, he turned. The next time you ask someone what their rank is, a pause. Consider that you might not want the answer. Bradley left without a word, but something in his face had changed on the way out. Something that looked, for the first time that night, less like a man defending himself and more like a man beginning, slowly, to understand exactly how much he had never questioned about his own life. He walked down the hallway alone, past a row of framed photographs documenting decades of Ashcombe leadership, faces he'd walked past 1,000 times without ever once looking closely at them. Tonight, for reasons he couldn't quite name, he looked. Every one of them had been the loudest voice in someone's room, once. He wondered, walking past the last frame, how many of them had ever been asked the question Charlotte Winters had just asked him, and how many had ever bothered to answer it honestly. Colonel Preston's interview began at 11:30. It lasted 47 minutes. It did not go well. Charlotte placed Meredith's 3 complaint files on the table, placed the incident logs Major Dawson had retrieved from a locked cabinet in Preston's own office, the one he'd emptied that morning and thought nobody would find, placed printed screenshots pulled from 4 confiscated phones, each one showing a different angle of the same humiliation. Preston looked at the table the way a man looks at a shallow grave he suspects has his own name on the headstone. Colonel Preston, your command has processed a significant number of equal opportunity complaints over the past 24 months. The overwhelming majority were closed with no action taken. A small number were escalated, and only after outside pressure. Can you explain that pattern? Preston attempted an explanation. He used words like context, nuance, operational tempo. He said his team took every complaint seriously. He said he trusted his chain of command to resolve issues at the lowest possible level. Charlotte listened. Let him finish. Is there anything else you'd like to add? She asked. Once he'd run out of words that meant nothing, Preston hesitated. I've commanded this base for 3 years, General. 3 years without a single major incident reaching the press, without a single congressional inquiry. I've kept this base running. You've kept this base quiet, Charlotte said. Those are not the same thing. Then she opened her notebook. At 4:52 this afternoon, I was standing in your reception hall. One of your officers publicly told a visitor she was trash. Told her to get on her knees. Attempted to have her removed from the building. Her voice stayed level, which somehow made it worse. You were standing 30 feet away. You saw it. You heard it, and you took a sip of champagne and turned your back. She closed the notebook. That is not context, Colonel. That is not nuance. That is command failure. Preston opened his mouth. Nothing useful came out. This interview is concluded, Charlotte said. You'll be informed of the inspection findings through your chain of command. I'd recommend you begin thinking carefully about your next conversation with the Judge Advocate General. Preston stood. His legs didn't quite cooperate. He steadied himself against the back of the chair and walked out slowly, like a man leaving a doctor's office after news he already knew was coming, but had hoped, right up until the last second, might somehow be different. The door closed behind him. Charlotte sat alone in the conference room for a full minute. She looked at the stack of files in front of her, complaint after complaint. Most of them dismissed. Several of them from a 24-year-old petty officer who had kept every copy in a shoebox under her bed because some part of her refused to let the truth disappear completely. Charlotte opened her notebook to a fresh page. At the top she wrote 2 words, systemic failure. Then she sat back, rubbed her eyes, let herself, for exactly 10 seconds, feel the full weight of everything the night had uncovered. Because it wasn't just Bradley Sinclair. It wasn't just Preston. It was a structure built, piece by piece, over years, by people who had learned that silence was easier than accountability, and had taught that lesson down the chain until it became the water everyone at Ashcombe swam in without noticing. 10 seconds. That was all she allowed herself. Then she closed her eyes, thought of her father's face in the photograph tucked inside her notebook, thought of what her mother had said. He'd be proud of you. She opened her eyes, picked up her phone. There was one more call to make tonight, and this one wasn't going to be easy either. She dialed the number for the Pentagon liaison assigned to escalations. Waited through 3 rings. This is Winters, she said when the line connected. I need you to pull everything you have on retired Navy Captain Howard Sinclair, specifically any contact he's made in the last 24 hours with active duty personnel connected to Camp Ashcombe. A pause on the other end. Ma'am, are we looking at improper influence? We're looking, Charlotte said, at exactly how far this goes. She hung up, sat back in her chair. Because somewhere out there, a retired captain believed his name and his phone calls could still fix whatever his son broke. Charlotte Winters had spent her entire career proving men like that wrong. She wasn't about to stop tonight. Down the hall, Major Dawson knocked softly and stepped inside. Ma'am, it's past midnight. You've been at this for over 7 hours. I know. Do you want to pause? Pick this up in the morning? Charlotte looked at the stack of files, at Meredith's shoebox of complaints, sitting there like a small, stubborn monument to 2 years of being ignored. At the incident logs, the confiscated phones, the growing weight of everything this base had spent years pretending not to see. No, she said. We keep going, because somewhere, in this building, there were still more truths waiting to surface. Still more people who'd spent years learning to stay quiet. Still more folders in locked cabinets that hadn't been found yet. and because her father had run out of time before anyone gave him the chance to finish what he started. Charlotte Winters wasn't going to make that same mistake twice. She stood, straightened her jacket, picked up her notebook. "Who's next?" she said, and walked toward the door. Outside the window, the sky over Camp Ashcombe had gone fully dark, the runway lights blinking their slow, patient rhythm into the night, indifferent to everything happening inside the walls beneath them. Somewhere in the barracks, Meredith Callahan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the shoebox now sitting empty on her desk where the folder used to be. Somewhere in the locker room, Bradley Sinclair had finally changed out of his uniform and into civilian clothes, sitting on the same wooden bench, phone dark in his hand, no longer trying to write a message to his father at all. And somewhere down the hall, from the conference room, Colonel Gerald Preston sat alone in his darkened office, staring at an empty cabinet where 18 months of buried complaints used to live, trying to calculate exactly how many more locked drawers it would take before someone finally found all of them. The night was far from over, and Charlotte Winters had no intention of stopping until it was. The call came through at 1:17 in the morning. Major Dawson answered it first, listened, went very still, then walked the phone down the hallway to the conference room where Charlotte sat surrounded by folders stacked in uneven towers like a city built out of paper. "Ma'am, Pentagon liaison, you'll want to take this." Charlotte took the phone. "Winters. General, this is Colonel Ashford, escalations desk." A pause, the kind that told her whatever came next wouldn't be simple. "We pulled the phone records you requested. Captain Howard Sinclair, retired, made 3 calls in the last 18 hours, one to his son, one to a former academy classmate now serving on a promotions board." Another pause, "one to Colonel Preston's cell phone. 40 minutes before you arrived at the gate." Charlotte closed her eyes, because there it was, the confirmation she'd suspected since Bradley sat across from her and said quietly, "He usually does." 40 minutes before, she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." Which means Preston knew someone with influence was watching this inspection. "Before I ever walked through the gate. That would be the implication, ma'am." Charlotte thanked him, hung up, sat with the phone still warm in her hand. Because this changed everything. This wasn't just one careless lieutenant and one commander who'd rather look away than do his job. This was a man 3 states away, retired, no active authority whatsoever, reaching into an active investigation before it had even begun, trying to bend the outcome before the facts were on the table, which meant the rot didn't stop at Ashcombe's gate. It went further up the chain than anyone standing in that reception hall had understood. She looked at Major Dawson. "Get me everything on file about Preston's communications tonight. Every call, every text. I want to know exactly what he said to Sinclair, and exactly what he did after." "Yes, ma'am." Dawson left. Charlotte sat alone again, notebook open in front of her, pen hovering over a blank page. She thought about her father for a moment. Just a moment. The way his career had unraveled quietly, through phone calls made by people with more rank and better connections, none of it ever appearing on paper, none of it ever traceable back to a single decision anyone could be held accountable for. That was how it worked. That was always how it worked. Except tonight, she had the phone records. Except tonight, nobody was going to bury this in a locked cabinet and call it context. She picked up her pen, began to write. Outside, the base had gone quiet in the way military installations go quiet at night, not silent exactly, but hushed, the ordinary daytime noise replaced by the low hum of generators and the occasional distant call of a sentry changing posts. Charlotte barely noticed any of it. She had learned, over 20 years, to work inside a kind of tunnel. When a case started opening this wide, everything outside the folders in front of her, fading to something barely present. At 2:40 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Marsh knocked and stepped inside, carrying a laptop, and an expression Charlotte had learned, over the years, meant something significant had surfaced. "Ma'am, we finished the forensic review on Preston's system." Marsh set the laptop down. "The complaint database shows entries deleted going back 14 months, 14 separate cases, removed from the digital tracking system entirely. But we found physical copies in a second locked cabinet, one his executive officer didn't know about. Charlotte leaned forward. Show me. Marsh pulled up the scanned documents, one after another. Names. Dates. Complaints filed, then vanished from every system except the one nobody was supposed to find. A pattern again. The same pattern over and over, like a fingerprint left on every surface in the building. This isn't negligence, Charlotte said quietly. This is a system. Yes, ma'am. He didn't lose these complaints. Her voice hardened just slightly. He hid them. On purpose, repeatedly, over more than a year. Marsh nodded. There's something else, ma'am. One of the recordings we pulled from a confiscated phone. It's not from tonight. She turned the laptop screen toward Charlotte. It's from 3 months ago. A hallway conversation. Preston, talking to his executive officer. She pressed play. Preston's voice, tinny through the phone speaker, but unmistakable. If it doesn't make the news, it didn't happen. Keep it off the books. That's not a suggestion. Charlotte sat back. Because there it was. Not a mistake. Not an oversight born of a busy command and too many demands on his time. A policy, spoken out loud, recorded by accident, 3 months before anyone had ever heard the name Charlotte Winters. Preserve that recording, Charlotte said. Flag it as primary evidence. This isn't a command climate failure anymore. Her voice went flat, final. This is obstruction. Marsh hesitated at the door. Ma'am, can I ask something? Go ahead. How many bases have you walked into and found something like this? Not the incident tonight. This. She gestured at the laptop. The cabinet inside the cabinet. Charlotte considered the question a long moment before answering. More than I'd like, she said. Fewer than I fear. Marsh nodded slowly, like that answer told her something she needed to hear, even if it wasn't comforting. Get some rest if you can find 20 minutes, Charlotte added. We've got hours left. Marsh left. Charlotte sat alone again with the laptop still open. Preston's recorded voice frozen mid-sentence on the screen. She played it once more, then closed the laptop and turned back to her notebook. Because there was still work to do, and the night showed no signs of slowing down to accommodate anyone's exhaustion. At 6 a.m, as gray light started to bleed through the conference room blinds, Charlotte's secure phone rang again. She didn't recognize the number. She answered anyway. General Winters. A man's voice came through, older, cultured, carrying the particular confidence of someone who had spent 30 years being obeyed the moment he opened his mouth. General. Howard Sinclair. Retired Navy, though I suspect you already knew that. Charlotte's jaw tightened, just slightly. Captain Sinclair, it's 6 a.m. I imagine you've had a long night. A pause calculated. The kind men like this used to make silence feel like leverage. I'll be brief. My son made a mistake tonight. A serious one. I'm not calling to excuse it. Then why are you calling? Because Bradley has a career worth saving. 2 deployments. A Silver Star nomination that took years to build. I'm asking you, one officer to another, to consider the full picture before this becomes something neither of us can walk back. Charlotte let the silence sit for a moment before she answered. Because she knew exactly what this call was. She'd received calls like it before, over the years, dressed up in different voices, different ranks, always circling the same request underneath the politeness. Make this go away. Captain Sinclair, she said, did you contact Colonel Preston last night, prior to my arrival at Camp Ashcombe? A pause, longer than the first one. I made a courtesy call. Nothing improper. 40 minutes before I walked through the gate. Silence. I have the phone records, Charlotte said. I have a recording of Colonel Preston instructing his staff to keep complaints off the books. I have 18 months of buried misconduct cases connected to your son and others under his command. And now I have documentation that you personally reached out to warn the base commander that an inspection was coming. That's obstruction of a federal investigation, Captain. Committed by a retired officer with no active authority, attempting to influence an active duty commander's response to a formal inquiry. Charlotte's voice didn't rise. It never needed to. I'd advise you to speak with an attorney before we speak again. You're going to ruin my son's entire life over one bad night. No, Charlotte said. Your son is going to answer for a pattern of behavior that stretches back at least 8 months, and independently by a young petty officer who had the courage to keep records nobody else believed mattered. What happens to his career depends on what the investigation finds, not on what you're willing to spend to make it disappear. You don't understand what it took to build that career. I understand exactly what it took. Charlotte's voice went quiet now, quiet in a way that carried more weight than shouting ever could. My father spent 15 years building a career too, Captain. He reported wrongdoing exactly once, followed every regulation, trusted the system to protect him the way it was supposed to. A beat. It didn't. Men like you made sure of that, quietly, efficiently, without ever leaving fingerprints. Silence on the line now, a different kind. He never made captain, Charlotte continued. Never got the command he spent his whole life working toward. Died 4 years after retirement, and I have spent every day since wondering how much of that was the job, and how much of it was men exactly like you, making phone calls exactly like this one. I didn't know your father. No, Charlotte said, but I know you. I've known men like you my whole career, and I am done letting phone calls decide outcomes that belong in an investigation file. A long pause. When Sinclair spoke again, some of the polish had gone out of his voice. What happens now? Now I finish the job I came here to do. What happens to your son depends entirely on what the evidence shows, and I'd remind you that further contact with anyone connected to this investigation, direct or indirect, will be treated as an aggravating factor, not a mitigating one. And what happens to me? That, Charlotte said, is a question for the Judge Advocate General, not for me. But I'd start preparing an answer. She hung up before he could respond. Sat there for a moment breathing, because that call had cost her something. Some cost she didn't examine too closely, not while there was still work to finish, but she felt it sitting in her chest anyway, heavy and unresolved, the old grief stirred up and refusing, for once, to settle back down quietly. She thought of her father's face again. Not the photograph this time, the real memory, worn soft at the edges the way all old memories become. Him at the kitchen table, going through paperwork, long after she'd been sent to bed. The light from his desk lamp, the last thing she saw before falling asleep most nights that year. She hadn't understood, at 8 years old, what he was fighting. She understood it perfectly now. She picked up her pen, wrote 3 words at the bottom of the page: escalate to JAG. Then she closed the notebook and went to find Major Dawson, because the sun was coming up and there was still a report to write. The inspection report landed on the Secretary of the Army's desk 11 days later. 49 pages, 11 appendices, 102 footnotes, each one a small, precise brick in a wall. Charlotte had built one interview at a time. She had titled it Command Climate Assessment, Camp Ashcombe Special Operations Compound. Inside the Pentagon, people started calling it something shorter within a week. The Ashcombe Report. The findings broke into 3 tiers. Tier 1, individual misconduct. Tier 2, leadership failure. Tier 3, systemic obstruction. Most inspection reports carried 1 tier, occasionally 2. 3 tiers meant the rot went all the way to the foundation, and everyone who read the report knew it. Those 11 days had not been quiet ones for Charlotte. She'd spent them at her desk in Washington, door closed, phone forwarded to Dawson, except for calls she specifically cleared, writing and rewriting sections, until every sentence could survive a challenge from a defense attorney, a congressional staffer, or a retired captain with a grudge and a Rolodex full of old classmates. She'd called her mother twice more during those 11 days. Neither call was long. Both mattered. The consequences arrived in waves, each one landing weeks apart, each one changing the shape of Camp Ashcombe a little more. The first wave hit Bradley Sinclair. He received formal notification of proceedings under Article 15 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Conduct unbecoming an officer. Violation of equal opportunity regulations. Failure to maintain standards of professional conduct. He wasn't court-martialed. Charlotte had been specific about that in her report. Lieutenant Sinclair's behavior while serious, developed within a command environment that consistently rewarded aggression and punished dissent. Individual discipline without structural reform addresses the symptom, not the disease. But symptoms still carried weight. Bradley was suspended from his unit. His Silver Star nomination, the one his father had called a formality, was withdrawn entirely. He was reassigned to an administrative post at a training facility in Georgia, the kind of posting with no deployments and no audience, just paperwork and quiet and time to think, mostly about a question he hadn't been able to answer at 11 in the evening in a conference room. Why did you say those things? He spent the first few weeks of the new posting angry at Charlotte, at Meredith, at the recordings on the confiscated phones, at everyone except the one person the anger might have actually belonged to. It took almost a month before the anger burned down into something closer to honesty. He started keeping a notebook of his own, not because anyone told him to, but because he'd watched a woman in a gray suit write down the truth while an entire room laughed at her, and some part of him, buried under years of being told that loud was the same as strong, had never quite stopped thinking about that. His father called the night the orders came through. For the first time in Bradley Sinclair's entire life, Howard Sinclair had nothing to say. The silence on that call lasted almost a full minute. Bradley didn't fill it. Some part of him understood, for the first time, that his father's silences had always been a kind of control too, and that filling this one wouldn't change anything that actually needed to change. I don't know what to tell you, his father finally said. You don't have to tell me anything, Bradley answered. I think that might be the first time in my life that's actually true. The second wave hit Colonel Gerald Preston. He was formally relieved of command. The official language read loss of confidence in ability to command. 7 words that meant exactly one thing. Finished. The relief cited 3 findings. Failure to enforce equal opportunity policy, evidenced by a dismissal rate far above Army average. Failure to act during a witnessed incident of officer misconduct. Deliberate concealment of complaint records during a period he knew was subject to review. That third finding buried him completely. When Dawson's team pulled the second locked cabinet, they found not just Meredith's 3 complaints, but 11 others removed from the digital system entirely. No trail, no accountability. Preston hadn't simply ignored complaints. He'd engineered their disappearance. Preston submitted his retirement paperwork within 72 hours. No ceremony, no farewell dinner, no folded flag handed over with practiced solemnity. He drove off base on a Tuesday morning in a rental car. The gate guard, the same one who had waved Charlotte through 11 days earlier, without a second look, waved Preston through too, and said nothing at all. In the weeks that followed, word filtered back to Charlotte, the way word always eventually filtered back to her, that Preston had told a former colleague he still believed he'd done nothing any other commander in his position wouldn't have done. Charlotte read that second-hand comment in a briefing note and sat with it a long moment. That, she thought, was the most honest thing Preston had ever said, and it was exactly the problem the rest of her report had been written to solve. The third wave was quieter, and it reached further than either of the first 2. Acting on Charlotte's recommendations, the Inspector General's office ordered a full restructuring of Ashcombe's command climate infrastructure. The changes were specific, measurable, built to be difficult to undo. An independent equal opportunity office, reporting directly to the regional inspector general instead of the base commander. Mandatory complaint timelines. Acknowledgement within 48 hours. Investigation within 14 days. Resolution within 60. Every complaint and its outcome, logged in a centralized database, visible to oversight authorities who didn't answer to the base they were overseeing. A command climate survey every 6 months, results delivered to the Inspector General's office before anyone at Ashcombe saw them, which meant no commander could shape the story before it reached someone with the authority to act on it. 12 officers received formal counseling. 3 senior enlisted leaders were reassigned. The executive officer, who had refused to hand a chief petty officer a complaint form, was placed under separate investigation. The culture didn't change overnight. Culture never does. But the architecture changed. The walls that had protected bad behavior for years came down, and in their place, someone finally built windows. And then there was Meredith. 3 weeks after the reception hall, Petty Officer 3rd Class Meredith Callahan received a letter from the Inspector General's office, signed by Lieutenant General Charlotte Winters. The letter confirmed all 3 of her previously dismissed complaints had been reopened, reviewed, substantiated. The senior chief who'd called her a quota hire received a formal reprimand. The individuals responsible for the note left on her barracks door were identified through witness interviews and disciplined. Bradley's comment about lowering the bar was formally added to his record, weighed alongside everything else. The letter said one more thing. Something not required by any regulation. Something Charlotte had chosen to add. You kept records when the system gave you every reason to stop keeping them. You spoke when the room around you had learned, over years, to stay silent. What you did that night did not simply support this investigation. It made the investigation possible at all. Meredith read the letter 3 times, folded it along the same crease each time, placed it inside the manila folder with her original complaints. Then she put the folder on top of her desk, where it stayed, where she could see it, every morning, a reminder that some things you hold on to, not because you have to anymore, but because they remind you of the day you stopped leaving and started standing. Her roommate Tammy found her sitting on the edge of her rack that evening, letter in hand, staring at nothing in particular. You okay? Tammy asked. Meredith nodded slowly. I think for the first time in 2 years, yeah. I actually am. 2 months after the report landed, Charlotte sat across a different table, in a different building, with Meredith Callahan, seated on the other side. This wasn't an interview. Charlotte had requested the meeting personally, through channels that made Major Dawson raise an eyebrow but ask no questions. You've been recommended for the Army's Leadership Development Program, Charlotte said. 6 months. Fort Leavenworth, officer candidate track if you want it. Meredith blinked. Ma'am, I don't have the qualifications people usually. You kept 18 months of documentation. Nobody asked you to keep. Built a case strong enough to reopen a system that had shut you down 3 times, and stood in a room full of officers ready to make you disappear, without disappearing. Charlotte's voice was steady, warm in a way it rarely allowed itself to be. I've spent 20 years watching people with far more advantages fail to do what you did in one night. Meredith looked down at her hands. I almost didn't come to that conference room. I know. What made you think I would? Charlotte considered the question longer than Meredith expected. Because I've spent my whole career looking for the person in the room who's still writing things down when nobody else will. When I saw your face in that hallway, that 1 second, a pause, I recognized something. What? Someone who hadn't given up yet, even when giving up would have been easier. Meredith's eyes went bright, and she looked away for a moment, blinking hard. My father, Charlotte said, quieter now, tried to do what you did, a long time ago. Different base, different decade. He filed a report, followed every rule, trusted the system to protect him. She paused. It didn't, and I spent a long time believing that meant people like him, people like you, always lose in the end. Do you still believe that? Charlotte looked at her for a long moment. Not tonight, she said. Not after watching you open that folder. Meredith didn't say anything, didn't need to, because some conversations aren't about words at all. They're about 2 people recognizing, quietly, that the weight one of them carried for years had finally found somewhere to set itself down. There's something else, Charlotte said. Fort Leavenworth is a long way from anyone you know here. It's going to be hard, and there will be nights you doubt you belong there. How do you know that? Because I doubted it too. Every year for the first decade. Charlotte allowed herself the smallest smile. It doesn't go away entirely. You just learn to keep writing anyway. Take the program, Charlotte said. Not because I'm recommending it. Because you've already proven you belong somewhere bigger than a serving tray in a reception hall. Meredith nodded, slowly. Yes, ma'am. She hesitated at the door on her way out, turned back. Ma'am, thank you, not for the recommendation, for the 13 minutes. Before you even knew who I was. Charlotte held her gaze. Thank you for the 18 months before that, she said, before you knew anyone was ever going to ask. 6 months later, Charlotte Winters returned to Camp Ashcombe. She didn't arrive in a gray suit this time. She arrived in full dress uniform, 3 stars on each shoulder, ribbons stacked 4 rows deep, the same leather notebook tucked under her arm, its cover softer now, worn down by another half-year of use. The gate guard recognized her before she even reached for her identification. He saluted so fast he nearly dropped his clipboard. The base looked the same from the outside. Same runways, same hangars, same flat Virginia land stretching out toward a horizon that didn't care what happened underneath it. But inside, the air had changed. Not perfect, not fully healed, different. The new commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Lang, a 26-year veteran hand-picked by the regional command, met Charlotte at the entrance. General Winters. Welcome back, ma'am. Colonel Lang, how's the climate? Lang didn't sugarcoat it. Better, not fixed, better. She fell into step beside Charlotte as they walked. The Independent Equal Opportunity Office processed 31 complaints in 6 months. Everyone investigated. Everyone answered. Some people still don't trust the system yet. Can't blame them. Trust takes time, Lang said. Accountability takes longer, Charlotte answered. They walked through the compound together. Charlotte noticed small things along the way, the kind of details that only mattered if you knew what you were looking for. A junior enlisted woman walking through a corridor, without instinctively pressing herself against the wall to let officers pass. A mixed group, officers and enlisted, sitting together in the break room, no longer separated the way they'd been arranged. Unspoken but absolute, 6 months earlier, a bulletin board near the main office, with the Equal Opportunity Reporting line printed in letters large enough to read from 20 feet away. Small things. But culture is made of small things, one on top of another, until eventually they hold weight. There's a young sergeant on the eastern side of the base, Lang said, as they passed a training yard. Filed a complaint against a senior NCO 2 months ago. Got a full investigation, a resolution, and an apology, all inside the 60-day window. She told her platoon she didn't think anyone would believe a word she said. Lang glanced at Charlotte. I keep hearing that same sentence from different people. Different names, same sentence. I didn't think anyone would believe me. That sentence is the whole report, distilled, Charlotte said. Everything else is just paperwork around it. Near the end of the visit, Charlotte passed the reception hall. The same marble floors, the same double doors, the same portrait of the long-retired admiral, still hanging exactly where it had before. She paused in the doorway, looked at the spot near the back wall, where she'd once stood in a plain gray suit, holding a notebook, watching a room decide, one laugh at a time, what kind of people they wanted to be. Major Dawson, walking beside her, followed her gaze. You okay, ma'am? Charlotte looked at the marble floor. Somewhere on that stone, 6 months earlier, a visitor's badge had landed face up, after a young lieutenant tore it from her lapel. She could still hear the small plastic sound it made hitting the ground, could still hear the laughter that followed, rolling across the room like something alive. I'm fine, she said. I was just thinking. About what, ma'am? Charlotte allowed herself a small smile, the first real one Dawson had seen from her since the inspection began. He asked me what my rank was. A pause. The truth is, my rank wasn't what mattered that day. Then what did? A 24-year-old petty officer had been keeping copies of complaints in a folder under her training manuals for 18 months, waiting, hoping someone would come along who was worth handing them to. Charlotte looked at Dawson. I didn't change Ashcombe, she said. She did. I just opened the door. Dawson considered that a moment. You gave her a door to walk through, ma'am. That's not nothing. No, Charlotte agreed. It's not nothing, but it's also not everything. The door only matters if someone's brave enough to walk through it. She was. I've met plenty of people who weren't, and it wasn't a failure of courage. It was a failure of every door that came before. They walked out of the building, together, into a late afternoon sun that felt, for the first time in a long while, entirely uncomplicated. Charlotte's sedan waited near the entrance. She climbed in, set the leather notebook on the seat beside her, closed the door. The car pulled away from Camp Ashcombe, and this time she didn't look back. Behind her, in the enlisted barracks, Petty Officer 3rd Class Meredith Callahan finished packing a bag for her first day at Fort Leavenworth. Leadership Development Track, nominated personally by Colonel Lang on the recommendation of a 3-star general who had once watched her cross a crowded room with a champagne tray and seen, in 1 second of eye contact, something worth believing in. Meredith zipped her bag, looked around the small room one last time, picked up the manila folder from the top of her desk. She didn't need it anymore. The Army had its own copies now, filed and reviewed, and answered the way they should have been answered from the very beginning. She packed it anyway, because some things you keep, not because you have to, but because they remind you of the day you stopped leaving and started standing. Tammy walked her to the gate that morning, helped load the last bag into the transport van, and hugged her longer than either of them expected. "Right when you can," Tammy said. "I always do," Meredith answered, and for the first time, the joke actually made both of them laugh. Charlotte's phone rang somewhere over the Virginia state line, 40 minutes into the drive home. She answered without looking at the screen because she already knew who it was. "Hi, Mom. How'd it go?" The return trip. Charlotte looked out the window at the fields sliding past, gold and green under a sky finally clearing after a week of rain. "Good," she said. "Better than good. Tell me." And so, for the second time in 6 months, Charlotte Winters told her mother a story about Camp Ashcombe. This time, there was no shaking in her voice, no weight sitting unspoken beneath the words, just a quiet kind of pride, the kind that had taken 30 years and one long, impossible night to finally earn its place. She told her about the sergeant on the eastern side of the base, who'd finally been believed, about Colonel Lang and the windows where the walls used to be, about Meredith packing a shoebox folder she no longer needed into a bag headed for Fort Leavenworth. Her mother listened to all of it, without interrupting, the way she always had, ever since Charlotte was young enough to climb into her father's lap and listen to him explain, in careful, patient words, what it meant to do the right thing, even when nobody was watching. "He'd be proud of you," her mother said when Charlotte finished. "You know that." Charlotte smiled, alone in the car, notebook resting on the seat beside her like it always did. "I know," she said. And this time she said it like she meant it. Because the loudest voice in the room isn't always the one with power. Real authority doesn't announce itself. It watches, it listens, it waits. And then when the moment finally comes, it moves.